Welcome, everyone. Give me a wave if you can hear me.
We can hear you.
Okay. Graham, would you or someone like to introduce when you're ready?
Sure, I'd be happy to introduce you if you'd like.
Okay.
Yeah, everyone. This we're happy to have this presentation by Tim McCormick. Tim McCormick has been a member of our vehicle residency collective for geez, I don't know, 6 months or more, and is an excellent scholar and thought leader around alternative forms of housing and innovations in housing. And I'm really excited to hear everything that you have to share with us today, Tim. Tim is also, I should mention, has been on our summit planning committee and has been one of the people who helped to bring together this summit, and also helped to encourage us to have this second day. And I'm not sure if we met the goal of it, but as an unconference format, what you mentioned, but to really at least have more of a space for people to have direct conversation rather than to have more presentation driven content. And so I really just want to say thank you, Tim, for leading us in that direction, for pushing us to do better, like I said, and for all the great work that you do. So without any further ado, everyone, Tim McCormick.
Thank you, Graham. Kind and impromptu introduction. I would like to share my screen, and so I'm just going to set that up. Give me 1 second. Looks like desktop one. Let me hide the evidence.
And Tim, I'll be your chat moderator, just so you know. So you don't
Okay.
need to. I'll be monitoring chat, sending over questions when you're ready.
Okay, very good. Thank you. And are you seeing my screen now?
Yes.
Okay. And this is what I'm going to do actually is just pull up a Google Doc, which is where I've been developing this. And I will, you will see the link on it. Let me just get this screen showing the right way. View, enter full screen. And then I also want to go to viewing. There we go. Okay, there we go. All right, so if I've done this right, you should be seeing sort of a title screen.
Yes.
And so the title slightly different than what's on the online agenda is vehicles as housing, housing as vehicle. And here's my name and contact information. Also, right here is a URL that goes to this document. If anyone wants to go to that directly or get it later. You could also just Google like Tim McCormick Portland and you'll get my website and find this. Well, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining. It's an honor to be here, and I've been learning so much listening in on sessions. And let's see. So my name is Tim McCormick. I'm the Director of Housing Alternatives Network, and that is a small nonprofit based here in Portland, Oregon, where I am now. And basically, that is a sort of a vehicle for me to support various projects of me and friends and allies exploring alternative housing of all kinds, which includes co-op, mobile, modular, DIY. And that basically is what I've been doing for the last 10 years as a researcher, designer, sometimes builder. And a little more about me. I identify as neurodivergent, as long-term, intermittently, varyingly homeless, or experiencing homelessness. And in appearance, I'm a white male, middle-aged, with black glasses, graying hair, to put it kindly. And so here's just a quick overview outline of what I'll talk about. I didn't really practice this out or time it, so I may aim to end a lot sooner and have more time for conversation. But just as an overview, intro about me, a little bit about looking at how we can look at things with a deficit model versus with a positive qualities viewpoint. And then I want to talk briefly about just stepping back and thinking for a minute and say what actually is a vehicle and what actually is housing. in historical and legal ways, and then observe that there's actually a whole bunch of ways that housing has historically been legally can be a vehicle or movable. And of course, the further you go back in time, that's, a large portion of all humans going back millennia have been nomadic in various ways, particularly prior to, organized agriculture 5,000 years ago. And the two parts of the title basically are looking at, vehicles as housing, pointing out all the ways that they can be, but also more generally, metaphorically saying that really we can look at all housing as a vehicle to other ends, things we want to achieve. And I want to make an argument that that's actually a really good way to think about housing in general. So that's a little overview there. Here's intro to me. There's the two halves of my point. And by housing as a vehicle, what I mean by that is to say all housing is or can be seen as a vehicle to other ends. In other words, instead of saying, sorry, I'm just trying to get rid of that video. Okay, there we go. In other words, I believe that rather than saying things that we often hear, for example, permanent housing is the solution or the goal, we should instead say, no, those are just structures and states of being, but what are the actual human goals we're trying to achieve? Like, let's say justice or community or opportunity, and then say, what forms of dwelling or living serve that? And not just assume that like some form of housing is the normative ideal. Now, a little bit more about me and where I'm coming from. Why am I interested in things like that? And like, why do I think these things would matter? Well, as I said, for the last 10 years, I've been living partly nomadically and researching, studying, visiting, living in building at times, all kinds of alternative housing, like homeless villages, camps, warehouse spaces. I've been living in trailers. I am right now living in a small cabin on a trailer at a building site for a nonprofit I work with that actually hires and trains currently or formerly homeless people to build housing in small structures. And I'm living in a cabin built by that nonprofit org in exchange for helping them. So in a general sense, where I find myself and what I focus on and try to put forth is a view of looking at housing from the bottom up, from the people who have nothing, who have just arrived, who have no credit, who have just emigrated, who have just got off the boat. And it's not the only way to look at housing, but it's not how it's normally looked at. So I try to bring that perspective. Also, it seems that if I look at myself and my family, I can see that family members on both sides going back generations have clearly been probably unusually migratory or floating or restless. So I think whatever the nomadic evolutionary past of man is, I feel it is relatively still present in my family line and genes. So as an interesting anecdote, I think my namesake McCormick great-grandfather actually stowed away as a ship during the Irish potato famine, also known as the Irish Genocide, as an orphan in the mid-19th century, was discovered a few days out of port, and he lived on the ship for some years after that, having been pressed into service. One of his sons, my grandfather, relocated wood frame houses and converted rail cars into housing at times among his various sort of building and developer entrepreneurial activities. My father lived on a houseboat in London. My sister did in Seattle. My uncle lived mobilely as a trailer for much of his later life. And also, I should say, I grew up moving between the US and UK. I identify as an immigrant, as are my parents and my grandparents. So from my point of view, looking at it historically and globally, people have been moving about in many ways forever, in many ways, in varying degrees. And it seems like this moving and displacement is actually growing now in the last decade or two because of political upset and so on, and very much because of increasing climate change. So these notions of like, how do people move around on different timescales and ways matters more and more globally. And anyway, it's what intrigues me. By the way, I'm just going to pause for a moment and say I'm not seeing the chat channel. So Graham, if someone says something in the chat that I should know, can you just pipe in and let me know?
I sure will. Nobody has written anything yet, but I'll.
Okay, good. Thank you. And let's see. Okay, so now as a perspective on this, some of you may know the term from working in homelessness. There's an expression, deficit model. And what this refers to is a phenomena which we all know, whether we know this term or not, which is that people considered needy on a margin are talked about and defined in terms of what they lack. The very word homelessness is defined by a lack of something. And the notion is that the very framing of people and phenomena that way, it's not invalid. It's obviously real. And this summit was formed around concerns that vehicle dwelling is a growing issue. It makes up a large, under-recognized and growing portion of homelessness, and that people living in vehicles, whether by necessity or choice, tend to face many issues of exclusion, stigma, discrimination, lack of places to go, lack of services, basically marginalization. Now that's all true, and we need to keep that perspective and realize all of those severe problems. But you could also say that this is kind of a deficit model where you're looking at a phenomena and a population in terms of like what it lacks. And there's a famous saying by W.E.B. Du Bois, I think it's from The Souls of Black Folk, where he says, "Do you know what it feels like to always be a problem?" And of course, there he was talking about Black Americans, but I think you could apply that to any group of people. Just the fact that your very definition, the very word that is by which you are described, the population you are considered to be part of, is defined as lacking something. Now, I agree with this perspective in a way because I care and don't want people to be marginalized, as in outcast and harmed. However, I also want people to be able to differ, to live divergent paths and truths, and sometimes get on boats or get on the road for the unknown, to strike out for the territory, as it says in Huckleberry Finn, and to have a choice to live on margins and frontiers and border zones, where they may feel more at home and more able to create a home and a self. And that would be to live in what I would call positive marginality, which is margins which are chosen, which give people more space to be who they are and want, and to discover a new world and build a new world. In part, I feel this strongly because it's very clear to me that I wouldn't exist or have the opportunities I do unless a number of my forebears had done that, had stepped out into the unknown and emigrated between Ireland and the UK and the UK and the US, around the US. More specifically, bringing it around to vehicle residency, I also feel that mobile dwelling or vehicle residency, it's not just a problem, but it actually has great potential to help us with many crucial issues personally and societally and globally. For example, housing affordability, as people have talked about before. Many people are just pragmatically turning to this as a form of affordability. Far more people could if it were more enabled. And a lot of what I work on actually in advocacy is state and local laws that would unlock those possibilities and take away the stigma. And also not just affordability, but suitability. Graham had some great comments earlier that I heard about how people that, even if they could pay rent in cases, they actually don't want to put money into that system, into that tenure. And I certainly feel that strongly. I've gotten by with not paying rent formally for much of the last 10 years, doing work exchange or other things. And I feel that has freed me up to do what I want to do. And then on a global scale, I think movable housing is powerfully suggested as for the goals of resilience and adaptation to disasters and climate change. Parenthetically, I've been kind of roaming between California and Oregon the last 10 years. And I've basically just been watching this clearly rising wave of unsettlement of people in California because of wildfires saying, wow, this is not a long-term proposition. Like, wow, I can't get house and home insurance. And, you know, friends of mine that have rural property are like losing their home and fire insurance, right? So it's really impending on the West Coast. And I think of that as a good thing in a way, because we're on the front lines and we can relate to what's being faced by Bangladesh and all the other coastal parts of the world. And then finally, I also think that the concept of vehicle dwelling or residency, they give us a really powerful lens to think about what is housing itself? What do we want from it? How can we change it? And how can we change ourselves to adapt, survive, and thrive? And, you know, as a person that does housing advocacy and research in general, this circles back, because it's not just like a sub area of housing. To me, it's like a powerful lens to look at all housing. So anyway, pulling back for a minute, being a librarian and sort of infonaut sort of person, I'm always thinking about, are we using terms clearly? So let's just start with a pretty simple question. What is a vehicle? And as you can see, I didn't really get around to working up my snappy graphics. So I'm falling back on my sketch graphics here. That was when I wrote out this talk originally. And so a vehicle is basically some structure that moves and conveys things or people. Now, we normally think of wheels, but it's good to remember that that could also be on rails. It could be on skids. It could be floating on water. It could be floating in air. It could be submerged, and it could be flying. And as I said, you know, in my family, a number of people have lived on boats. So that's very present in my mind. And the sun never sets on the British Empire, because half the British Empire is floating on boats over the seas. But there's another thing about this is beyond things that are just vehicles, there's a larger set of things that aren't in themselves vehicles, but can be moved by vehicles. And that's actually a big broad set of things. As I said, my grandfather would move entire homes, you know, between cities or across town. So, you know, all kinds of housing actually can be moved. It's a question of how much difficulty. So I suggest the terms mobile for vehicles and movable for the adjoining set of things that vehicles can move. Now, here's a more complicated question, really, is like, what is housing or residency? And I would say there's a lot of ways you can look at that, you know, legally, historically, kind of metaphorically, spiritually. But here's an effort, a definition. I would say it's a combination of durable physical shelter with legal or social rights to be in it. Now, there are all kinds of shelter and all kinds of legal rights. And if you try to map this out, you get kind of a spectrum or a set of overlapping states. And I went a little wild and indulged in some Venn diagrams down here, which for the people wanting an analytical view, you can look at this more closely. But my point basically is there are durable and habitable situations. If you can see my cursor, I'm over here. And there's a wide range of those. That could be a cave, that could be a hollowed out tree, for example. And there's this big circle here is like everything that's effectively habitable. And, you know, as I said, that's a whole bunch of things. There's a smaller circle inside, which is things that are legally habitable, which is things that our system recognizes. And unfortunately, our system, that is to say, in the United States, often excludes vehicles from being allowed as habitable, except for maybe certain special cases like in an RV park. So I'll just momentarily dive into this Venn diagram, realizing that it's complicated. But so you have a larger circle of places that you could, you know, physically live. You've got a smaller circle of places that are like legally allowed for that. Now, over on the other side, overlapping, you have legal social rights. And again, you've got a large circle, which is like effectively you could do it. You know, you might be living in a place where technically sublets aren't allowed, but as a practical matter, no one really cares. Or you might be parking and living in your uncle's yard in a trailer. well, legally not allowed, but as long as you don't cause trouble or maybe have the wrong accent or something, then it's okay. There's a smaller circle inside, which is places where you actually do have a legal formal right to reside. You actually have a lease. And at the intersection of these things of durable, legally recognized structure and social rights, right in the middle here is this kind of special case we call permanent housing. And this is almost sort of like an iconic special state. But I would point out that, first of all, we should recognize most people in the world don't really live in that state in the way that we hold up as an ideal. A very large portion of the world lives in, unstable circumstances without formal rights. And basically, that's been my case for at least the last 10 years. And, in a way, it's not what you'd expect of a middle-class educated person like me. But on the other hand, I've come to realize it's very ordinary for the globe and even for the country. And another observation about this so-called permanent housing is even what's called permanent housing is in many cases and ways really not that permanent or stable. If you're a renter in most of the US, your lease can be terminated or not renewed without any cause, or your rent can be raised maybe unlimitedly, which does the same thing. In the US, renters move on average every 2 years, owners every 7 years. Housing can be condemned or taken by eminent domain or foreclosed on by banks in a whole bunch of circumstances, including fraud and error. And that has happened widely. In West Oakland, where I used to live, a huge portion of all the housing was predatorily basically, captured by banks by creating mass unstable loans during the housing crisis in 2018 and then turned into their hands. It was just a widespread takeover, like a significant percentage of all housing in West Oakland. And of course, housing can be destroyed or rendered uninhabitable by all kinds of situations. And also, most of us don't really have like insurance against mishap or loss of income. So, for many people. We might also observe that there are ways that you could say housing can be more permanent, such as if you have, say, a housing benefit that's transferable, that you can move to a new location, or if your current place becomes uninhabitable. You might also say that a way to have more permanent housing is to have a lot of social capital and to live in a place where people respect you and your rights and won't allow you to be unhoused. And you could say that, many traditional societies are like that. They don't really have homelessness because they just wouldn't allow someone to be uncared for. Now, moving on to the sort of, vehicles as housing, it turns out that across that variety of housing states or situations, almost all of them could actually be a vehicle or movable. A lot more than most people realize. Now, first of all, there's the observation that housing that moves can be more permanent because you might be able to keep it with you, even if you move about. And that resonates with me because I've probably lived in between 30 and 40 places over the last 30 years. And at this point in my declining years, I'd like to have some more continuity and involvement and investment in my surroundings, even whether or not I'm settled in one place, as I probably won't be. Second of all, permanent housing includes mobile or manufactured housing, and it could include housing that's demountable, modular. And as was mentioned earlier in this conference, that actually makes up a huge portion of US housing stock. And at its peak in the early 70s, it was 40% of all new housing delivery. And many people believe that were it not shunned and suppressed by regulation, it could be much more now. Now, that type of housing is usually not moved more than once, but it in theory and technically it could be, because they require that a chassis remain in the structure, which you could put wheels back on. Now, here's the most amazing thing, though, that I just learned in the last few months. This is startling, actually. It turns out that even building code compliant housing, which widely is what people take to be what defines permanent fixed housing, even that can actually be mobile. Now, the reason that this has become known is that the Tiny House Industry Association, which I'm part of the communications committee for, naturally they're interested in this and thinking about how tiny houses and tiny houses on wheels can be used. Well, they started looking at building code and they said, you know what? It describes how to do foundations, but it doesn't actually say you have to have one. So they went and talked to the International Code Council, who runs this, and those guys, and I'm afraid to say they are almost all guys, but those people said, you're right. We just say how to do things. We don't say you have to do it. And they worked with the International Code Council to develop like this guidance letter, which you can put into your local code that just clarifies this point and says, actually you can make building code compliant housing and have it not be on a foundation. Now, it might be that localities will, if they realize this, will say, oh, wait, no, that's not what we meant. But the interesting thing is that the current laws on the books in many places turn out to not actually forbid housing being movable, because all they say is that it must meet building code. And so in order for them to block movable housing, they would have to change the law, which of course creates an opportunity for advocacy to step in and present a counter argument. Now, so that was all about, all the many and surprising ways that, vehicles can actually be housing, or housing can be movable and mobile. But I want to turn now to what is the second half of the title, which is housing as a vehicle in general. And as I said earlier, what I mean by that is to say, we can, and I argue we should, think of all housing as a means to accomplish things, not as an end in itself. We should say, what is it we want out of life? Do we want community? Do we want security? What achieves that? And if we take a physically defined thing like housing and we make it the end, then we're fetishizing it. We're turning it into, we're distorting our thinking. And so a vehicle in this sense means a conveyance, like we can say a vehicle for one's ambitions or an investment vehicle. Now, many people today, I should note, are kind of opposed to this concept in a way, because they say we need to return housing to its use value and move away from exchange value and financialization and get back to, housing for, its use in sheltering people. Now, I agree that financialization structures today are often very unhelpful. On the other hand, I do think that we should look at housing from the perspective of what does it do for us? And one of those things it may do for us is build an asset that you can use to move somewhere else. And another observation, taking that a bit further, is you can say, in a sense, we really don't want our housing to be permanent, in the sense that we don't really want to be permanently tied to it. And we want other housing out there to be not tied to other people, so we can choose to move and buy or rent it. In a sense, where there's really permanent housing, that would be something like a feudal society. And if you look at a feudal society, most people were tied to the land, to an estate, whether they were serfs or lords. If you're a serf, you weren't free to leave. And if you're a lord or landowner, you're not free to sell or transfer the land. And mobility, meaning not being permanently tied to a location, and alienability of property, meaning land is not tied to people, were fundamental drivers of the development of modern civil rights and modern societies. So in a sense, we actually deeply value having housing be non-permanent and transferable. We value owning it in part because we can build wealth and acquire or move somewhere else. So given that housing is valued for its transferability and as a vehicle for goals, in a way, it's perfectly logical to extend it to say, let's value it being literally movable if we want it to be. As in other ways, that movability can be enabling for us. It can help us permanently live where we want to live as that place changes. Now, we have to consider, why does movable housing, trigger such fear and discrimination in so many circumstances for millennia? Well, I think you could say that housing being movable seems to threaten stability, the order and makeup of a community or who lives in it, or perhaps the community's ability to manage and tax. But I would observe that housing being transferable really does the same thing. It means we can't really control who joins or leaves the community, or possibly even be very able to regulate or tax it. If there's an unfamiliar RV parked on your street, which is the case on a large portion of streets in Portland and Seattle, I can testify, it may be unsettling, but you may actually have more ability to find out who lives in it and owns it than you do about the house or the condo next door. I mean, for one thing, there's someone living in it. You can go talk to them. And it also probably has a license plate, has a vehicle identification number. The house next door may have none of that. I'd also point out that if we wanted to, we could take movable housing and make it more, incorporated in part of the community, because rather than just having anonymous vehicle dwellers living in stealth, we could, if we wanted to, have what I call a parking dwelling permit system. And so you would be able to get a permit like this in the way that you currently get a license plate and a parking permit. And that would be a path to, engage occupants and owners and, make them part of the community in that way. It's kind of like safe parking areas, but it's in a more sort of broad scale and fluid way. And let's see. Finally, I'm going to move towards wrapping up here. I would say that one way you can look at vehicles is you can say vehicles are something that transforms us. They're a type of transformation. And other things are as well. Wealth is social capital. And I would say if we believe that another world is possible and another self is possible, then we must believe in and support means of transformation. Some housing supports that by giving you community and support. Some housing doesn't. It traps you and exploits you and controls you. Some vehicles support it, some don't. Vehicle housing not only does support it, but I would suggest is among our best models, means, and metaphors for social transformation, for having a changeable self and a changeable society. Because I would say transformation is life, it's survival, it's progress, and it's necessary. It's increasingly necessary in a changing world. So finally, I'm just going to leave with a quote I heard recently from Michel Foucault. He said, "The ship is the heterotopia par excellence. In civilizations without ships, dreams dry up." And with that, I'm going to open up the chat and invite questions or comments. Graham, do you want to perhaps let me know anything that's been in the chat or any questions?
Yeah, so far I haven't seen any questions. And I did want to give you a quick update. We actually have been recording the whole thing. So my apologies for the confusion. Everything's fine. It's been recorded since the beginning. Okay,
that's what I thought, because I thought I did hear it at the start.
Yeah, and I appreciated you mentioning that. I noticed I didn't hit record, and so I noticed.
Okay.
Everything's fine.
Well, we can edit out the confusion.
So if anybody has any questions, I encourage you to enter them in chat. And you've got plenty of time, Tibbs, as you know.
Or just speak up. Yeah, I mean, we have, I think I used about just 35 minutes there. Or Graham, your responses. Graham, I was hoping to catch all of the intro yesterday about history of vehicle residency, because obviously we're looking at similar issues, but unfortunately I didn't have a good connection then. But so I hope I haven't completely repeated something or completely missed a point of view that you were explaining there.
Oh no, actually, I think that far from it. I think that you actually you and I have spoken many times, Tim, and so I think that we align a lot in what we think here. And I wouldn't say you reiterated, but you said a lot of what I said in a very different way and had it from a different perspective. So I think I really appreciated everything you had to bring here. The only thing I wanted to point out was that we didn't. Our intention of this summit, we worked really hard with our people with lived experience, was not to follow that deficit model, because I
Right.
also am familiar with it, and we wanted to definitely point at the positive benefits of vehicle residency and really to be fighting for or advocating for the civil rights of vehicle residents. So that was
Yeah.
all.
And I
I
think
don't
that
mean it
has
to be
come through.
contentious. That's all I just wanted to clarify.
I mean, just having people here speaking their own story
Yeah,
is positive, right? I mean, it's self-representing, and I think that's
absolutely.
come through strongly. And like I say, deficit model is kind of like a negative way to put it. We don't want to like pretend that there aren't a bunch of real problems and issues, but we also want to say, let's beware the trap of like being framed as a negative or as a deficit.
That's right.
And I what I try to put forth is the idea that one way you can look at housing is, there's kind of core housing in a given society, more typical or honored or upheld kinds. In our society, that would be like single family housing. And then there's kind of outer reaches of it at further distances. And on one end, and you could say closer to the margin or marginal housing. And of course, some of that is very bad. That's homelessness, that's substandard housing, that's being exploited. But I also want to make the point that there are also positive margins where people are, homesteading, are creating innovative housing, are doing intentional communities, are building eco villages. And that when
Absolutely.
you think of the margins, we should think that there's positive and negative ones as well.
Absolutely, absolutely, and I think that if there was one thing that maybe you missed in the session that I talked about yesterday, was that really that again that deficit model that you brought up tends to frame the issue in a negative light, right? And in that way, it tends to restrict the way that we see it to being negative outcomes, which isn't always the truth, of course, as you pointed out, that there's so many positive benefits that can also be there. So we do actually
Yes.
have a question now
Okay.
in the chat. Elizabeth Mopan asked, and actually, Elizabeth, do you just want to unmute and ask the question directly?
Okay, I actually had a couple of questions. One was, what have you found to be the affordability range of movable modular housing? And the second one was, what's the hardest part of relocating mobile housing other than RVs?
Okay, thank you for those questions. So you said what's the affordability range for movable modular housing? Now I might want to clarify. Modular housing has a specific meaning in various state laws, like in California, and it means either an entire housing unit or portions of it are basically made off-site in a factory and are basically moved to a site and installed, usually, but not necessarily on a permanently fixed to a foundation. And I would say that that's a kind of a special niche that isn't particularly like affordability. Well, let's see. Now, I guess that's not true. There are a number of interesting projects out there where that tends. There's two zones where that tends to be used. One is in actually fairly high-end housing. So some well-off person gets a property up in the mountains, and they design and build a house modularly to install it there. And that's, typically not affordable at all. There's another case, which is like multi-unit housing. And actually, quite a few buildings are done that way. And hotels are built that way also. And you can see the logic. It's when you have many rooms that are, or units that are relatively similar. And, in some cases that can be quite large, like 30, 40, 50% cost savings. So, and actually shipping containers, you could say, are kind of one form of that. And so some examples that come to mind are in California, in LA, which has like the most severe homelessness issues, but also the most interesting wide range of things happening in response. There's a project called Hilda Solist First Care Village. And that was built on land that was like formerly a prison parking lot. It was shipping container-like structures, and it came out at like $200,000 per unit, which is about a third or a quarter. And it was also done very rapidly in like 9 months. So to me, that's a wonderful example. And then also in San Francisco, kind of the heart of the beast when it comes to affordability. I'm forgetting the name of the building, but it wouldn't be hard to find it. There was kind of a model project done that was completed the last 2 years, where they built it with modular units created by forgetting their name, a big modular builder based in Vallejo, and did it. And they got substantial, I think, 20, 30+% savings, and also did it more quickly. But 20, 30% savings is hundreds of thousands of dollars of difference. And also they're doing something new. So anything new will tend to get cheaper over time. So that's the modular. I would say, and your second question was, remind me, what's the most difficult part about
relocating
right,
mobile housing other than RVs?
Right, other than things that are vehicles. Well, that's a good question. So one thing is a key thing is, what has been required of the housing by the jurisdiction that allowed it. And so in most places, the typical thing is that jurisdictions that control it, city or county, will require that, any habitable building is permanently fixed to a permanent foundation, and also has full, is hooked into plumbing and sewer systems and electric systems. And I think that's rather unfortunate, because the ability to be fully off grid, as many people at this event know, it's always been possible, and it's gotten dramatically easier and more possible. And, tying into those grids is both very costly and also fragile. Like, I live in Portland, or am living in Portland, and we at any moment could have a gigantic earthquake, the Cascadia Fault, that would knock out basically water and sewer to much of the western half of the state. I personally don't want to be tied into that, or need to be. Portland also has among the country's highest water and sewer bills. And so if you add that up, it's a huge cost to lower income households, or percentage of cost. And so, one thing is, unfortunately, if your jurisdiction has required you to do all that, it's going to be costly and difficult to move. And probably it just, wouldn't be viable. You just wouldn't plan to do that. Now, if you were a little bit more forward-looking and you were thinking about this, maybe you're kind of a survivor type, and you might have deployed some kind of modular building with this intent, and you might have used some kind of foundation attachment that's what they call demountable. And mobile homes use that kind of thing. There's obviously, you use some kind of strapping or bolting, it can be unbolted. And you might have done something like even if required to have water and sewer hookup, you could get it but not use it and have your own off-grid system. So that would help a lot. And then, but of course, what would help the most would be if you weren't required to do that at all in the first place. And so what's emerged in Portland is very interesting, because somewhat unexpectedly, I and a bunch of other advocates got into law the ability to live in a vehicle, which could be a tiny house on wheels or RV, as a permanent residence on any residential property. Now, they did push back a little bit and require an RV style hookup, but that's quite a bit simpler than a full sewer connection. And to me, that is very landmark, because it opens up the possibility of thinking, well, we can have people that park in Portland half the year and go elsewhere. And it's like having an RV park citywide in a sense. So that would help a lot. And I think that's the path to go down. I mean, generally, when you look at housing, I would recommend, there's a great article done by Sightline, and they worked, Michael Anderson did this, and they basically did cost comparisons of like what it takes to create housing. And they looked at, standard detached single family home, and then things like apartment buildings. And then they looked at ADUs, accessory dwelling units, which are more or less usually conventional building on a foundation, but like on a backyard. And that was the winner. But by far the big winner was a vehicle parked on a backyard. And that was like half the cost. It was down in the realm of like achievable at $400 to $500 a month. And so this senior researcher at Sightline, Michael Anderson, a friend of mine, he said, for years I've been fighting for like apartments and fourplexes, when in fact there was this actually way more affordable option like under our noses. And of course, it's not for everyone to live in an RV or tiny house, but it's one way to fill the gap, and it can serve a lot of people's needs. And the way housing works is you want to take the pressure away and offer diverse options. So I'd say push your jurisdiction or local city to allow that, or at least to ask why wouldn't we allow it if it's a way to allow much more flexible and low-cost housing. And I think in advocating for that, what's really helpful is to show beautiful tiny houses and villages. Oh, sorry, that's my timer clicking there for 45 minutes. Yeah.
Sorry, Timmy, I just want to let you know you have about 10 minutes left before we have to go back to the main room.
Okay, yeah. And so, there's a big advocacy project there, and it's like happening all over the country. That there's national groups like Tiny House Industry Association, which is actually very effective at this and is scoring wins place after place. And then there are local groups. And then gradually, general housing advocacy or homelessness groups are waking up to this possibility and saying, hey, we don't have to only think about building large apartment buildings in this traditional way. We might be able to do something that suits a lot of people quite well. That's in a way, it's traditional. It's like detached housing, but it's in backyards, or it might be in a village cluster. And what's really helpful for that kind of advocacy is to go from the abstract, like mobile housing, and present concrete, good examples, because people tend to have a very positive reaction when they see well done tiny houses and village clusters, and they see community, they see humane, healthy environments, and a wide range of people say that looks lovely, I'd love to live there or retire there. So anyway, I hope that answers the question, but if not, maybe follow up with me by email or whatever. Any other questions or thoughts from anybody?
Well, I have a question, Tim, but I want to make sure that anybody else has an opportunity. Again, we have about 10 minutes left before we're actually going to be moving into the main group. But if anybody else wants to raise their hand, otherwise I do have a question.
Yeah, pass that mic around.
Oh, Bob Whalen, please.
Yeah, hi.
Hi, Bob.
Hi. I just want to just reiterate. I work in Berkeley for a nonprofit, and one of our venues is a off-street safe parking lot for people living in RVs, and
Where's that?
That's Berkeley? One of the in Berkeley, yes.
Okay.
So yeah, we at our peak we had about 40 vehicles staying there, and the real issue for us was kind of something you mentioned, is that they see that only as a temporary solution until what they call permanent housing comes along, and what the people living in their vehicles see it as a permanent solution, and they just need a place to be. So and it makes so much more sense that is your plan, and you don't have you're not looking for something more, and how precious it is that people are willing to reduce their carbon footprint, live in a smaller space, live without the amenities that other people seem to think they need. So yeah, it's just amazing to me how we don't see the obvious solution, because we're so attached to these ideas that we've lived with for so many years.
Right. Well, a couple thoughts. Thank you for sharing that. I think I'm familiar with the RV thing in Berkeley because I lived in the Bay Area and things like it. But sorry, go ahead.
That was it. I just want to thank you.
Oh, good.
For putting this on, and your presentation was very insightful.
Thank you. Well, a couple thoughts about that. I agree that if you work on this kind of stuff, you feel like it's like this permanent drumbeat from officials and other people. Permanent housing is the answer. And of course, when they say that, they have a very particular thing in mind, which is doesn't include vehicles. And it's like this complete wall that you can't break through. And I guess maybe it's the kind of thing that, well, you have to, at some point, moments of opportunity open for a shift in thinking, and you have to sort of patiently wait until that happens. Another question is to try and think about, like, what is it that makes people think that way? Well, I think a key reason is virtually every person in any decision-making position in government or anywhere else is almost certainly a homeowner and lives in permanently fixed housing. And so the notion of not living in a fixed location and even not even owning is pretty unknown, pretty uncommon. So it's just alien, they just don't experience it. And or maybe they have a notion of like retiring in an RV or something. So there's that. And then of course they have this set of experiences with like unlicensed stealth RV living and things coming to their attention as problems, as dumping waste and generating complaints. So, but on the other hand, there's many motivations and pressures on any officials, and they're also desperately trying to think about what can we do to manage homelessness or address it and provide affordable housing. And so the challenge is like, how do you build pathways that they actually see these things as like part of the solution and not part of the problem? And I think, like I said, just the practical thing of presenting compelling, positive, nice looking tiny homes or movable things is very helpful. And I should say that, I've spent some time living in RVs or trailers that like that are conventional, and in like stick-built tiny houses, and they're very different things, And it is the case that there is some validity to the point that things that were built for travel, like an RV, to a degree, are kind of inappropriate for year-round use, just in how they're built and insulated and so on. I don't want to like tell people they shouldn't do it, but there is a certain point that they kind of weren't built for that purpose, and they tend to be hard to heat and cool and so on. And you do things. They also basically are you can't really maintain them long. They're like a product, it's like buying an iPhone. They're not that particularly made for users to like fix and repair. But if you build a movable structure in more of a tiny house style, it basically can last as long as someone takes care of it, just like any other house does. And so very often you get a very different perception between these two cases. I'd also say, well, if people have got an RV, accommodate that, let them live in that, and maybe over time they upbuild or turn it into a movable house, that accommodate what's there and what people are finding to be a solution for them.
Tim, I'm getting messages from our main organizer that everyone's moving back in the main room. Okay, we have 3 minutes until the next session starts. I just want to say real quick, I've written about this before as a settlement bias, right, which is that the views of forms of settlement that we see as familiar, we tend to see as fit, and those right, that we see as unfamiliar, we see as unfit. And that in this sense, that the form of settlement really is the habitation of private property, which is reinforced by this sort of, bricks, sticks and bricks idea, 4 walls and a roof. Yeah. And in that way, and I unfortunately, we don't have time for this as a question, but it's just something I want to raise, and I'd love to talk with you more about this.
It's a good term.
I'm interested in a sense how tiny houses may also reinforce the normativity of tenancy, and how they may shift the ownership of the apartment, of the rental, onto the person who still has to pay for a space for that tiny house to be inhabited. And how in that sense, that may be why tiny house villages tend to receive more support within the systems versus safe parking programs for vehicles, because they don't have that same aspect, right? That vehicle housing doesn't have that sticks and bricks, 4 walls and a roof, ideology that's attached to it. And just sort of that, not to say that all tiny houses are bad, but that maybe that there's an aspect of the tiny house movement that is part of reinforcing the normativity of what we understand of housing. Yeah. But again, Tim, this was just such a wonderful presentation. Thank you so much for the time and this great content. This was great. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank everyone who joined, and feel free to follow up with me. you can, my address is up here on the slide. It's tim@tmccormick.org. If you Google Tim McCormick Portland, you'll get my site. So, thanks, everyone.
Thank you once again, Tim. I'm going to shut down this room so we all move back into the other room. Thank you again, Tim. I'll make sure that we save chat before we do, just so that we get this.
Oh, yeah. Great. Thank you.
Yeah, of course.